So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Oliver, for the invitation. My task was to focus a little bit more on what's going on in the field of sociology in terms of the past and the future of trust studies. And I'll try and give a sweeping view in 10 minutes. This talk is based to some extent on a paper that Oliver, Martin, Riemann, and I just finished for the annual review of sociology, and also a forthcoming chapter for the Mayer and Mayer volume, which thinks about an interdisciplinary perspective and agenda for trust research. In terms of the past, a lot of the research focuses on where does trust come from, where are the origins of trust, and what theories do we have about that. If we think of trust primarily as a willingness of an entity to become vulnerable to another entity, basically assuming that the trustee is to some extent concerned about our welfare, then there are a number of origins, and we can think about both particular trust in other individuals and peoples with whom we have relationships with, but also we can think of trust simply as a trait or a disposition. And we see that bifurcation reflected in the literatures in sociology and to some extent other fields. With respect to understanding the origins of trust as a stable trait, one of the major theories is social learning, and that if you remember Hardin's earlier paper on the epistemology of trust, we essentially learn to trust from early experiences, either with parents or role models or mentors. And we form some kind of general expectancy from those experiences of the capacity to trust our own disposition. There's also reinforcement learning work that talks about how we learn to become particularly trusting or not. And we develop to some extent, based on our own experiences and comfort levels, a sense of whether we are high or low trusters. And then, of course, there's work recently, less so in sociology, although a little bit in sociology, on the biological bases of trust. Things like hormones such as oxytocin and some of the early work on hormones, brain structures, and to some extent genes. In fact, Oliver, Martin, and I tried our hand at looking at the genetic component of trust in a study of twins, where we found that it could be estimated that about 30% of trust is heritable, whereas distrust is not inheritable or heritable, so that we would imagine that distrust comes mainly from our experiences. And then when we move on to relational trust, there are really three topics or variables that we tend to think about when we decide whether or not someone is trustworthy. We focus on the shadow of the past. What do we know about this particular person? What's our experience with this person or organization or institution? What in this domain, we have looked at relationship experience and whether or not, when in a relationship, a trust breach occurs. Obviously, when a trust breach occurs, there is a drop of trust after the violation. But interestingly, we found in this experimental study that there was a greater recovery from trust the longer people had experience with the relationship. So if the breach occurred early in the relationship, it was much harder to get back to a higher level of trust. And we're not sure how much that applies outside the lab, but I think in many respects it might. And then, of course, there's a broader network in which our relationships are embedded. And in this case, we tend to focus on having a good reputation. And wanting to maintain that reputation makes us more trustworthy in many domains, including the world of business and to some extent in the world of the internet. Let me move quickly then into thinking about the future of trust studies. In the annual review paper, we discuss an extended framework of three particular trust radiuses. If you think about the classic statement that A trusts B with respect to X, you can think of those not just as individual points or particular points on a continuum, but or endpoints, but as a continuous dimension. And here we've pictured it as emerging from highly particularized to highly generalized along both the dimensions of being a truster or trustees and also trust objects. It's probably easiest to understand with respect to trust objects. In a particular sense, I might trust you with respect to one particular domain of activity, but not many others. So I've often said I trust my husband with respect to the children, but not with respect to our finances. This framework allows us to think through not just the relationship between particularized and generalized trust, but intermediary cases where we're thinking about categorical trust. So groups of individuals, and there's more and more work on intergroup relations and the extent to which things like political identity have solidified, and particularly in the US, and make us likely or unlikely to trust one another. An interesting question that's raised in this domain is what's the relationship between particular trust and generalized trust? And some view us as more likely, if we're general trusters, to be able to enter trusting relationships that are particular relationships, but which would imply a positive correlation. Others have implied that this relationship is negative. For example, my former collaborator, Toshio Yamagishi, used to say that while general trust is low in Japan, particularized trust is high. So to some extent, there is a negative correlation in that context. Oliver sent out the study by Ron Bird, or the reference to it, just this past week. And in his study, he shows that the Chinese CEOs in strong networks, when they've been particularly successful, tend not to be able to cooperate as easily outside those networks. Again, implying a kind of negative relationships between strong trust networks and the capacity to move beyond that to develop generalized trust. There are other areas in which we think that further research would be beneficial in sociology and in the social sciences more broadly. To some extent, sociologists have focused more on benevolence, whether the partner will take your interests to heart, and also maybe competence, but less so integrity and affect-based trust, looking at non-cognitive factors that affect trust, and the role of emotions, for example. We might also do more work on trust simply as an independent variable. There's a lot of emphasis on trust as a dependent variable. What leads to trust? What happens when trust is high or low? But what are the consequences of that? In Edelman, in Russell's talk, it seems like they've done a lot of work looking at least trust in institutions and its impact in various domains. We might also do additional work on trustworthiness. The famous ability, benevolence, and integrity dimensions have been studied quite a bit, but we often don't know exactly the weights of those particular dimensions in different domains of activity or in different settings. And finally, a lot of the research, at least in sociology, is based either on experimental work at the more micro level or survey methods. And are there other methodologies that we might use that would build or give us additional insights? Expanding the use of qualitative approaches, for example, some of those studies have been particularly informative. Thinking about additional simulations or even field experiments, which are becoming more popular in sociology and also political science. Even thinking about conversation analysis, what do we know from what people say? I was once involved in a study of physicians and patients, and in the interviews, when we transcribed them, you could understand a lot about the nature of those relationships by looking at how they communicated with one another. I was going to end by talking about the importance of trust in institutions, just because I think it's so critical in places like the US right now, because trust not so much in business or the military, but in government and government agencies is so low. And certainly to some extent, the political divide is making that even worse. So thinking further about what are the sociological approaches that could be taken to understand how do we get out of a low trust sort of cycle, and how do we break through? Even how might examining the role of distrust in making institutions more responsive might help. I'm not sure I have filled 10 minutes, but I think I'll stop here and we can wait for questions. Thank you.